Stranger Things, Week 13, Time Travel, Teleportation, and Hidden Places. The beginnings of our modern understanding of time travel really are owed once again to fictional writers, particularly early scientific or science fiction writers such as H.G. Wells, in specific his classic from 1895, The Time Machine. So this is the origin of various modern interpretations such as Michael J. Fox 1985 hit Back to the Future, where the DeLorean sports car is the time machine, or in other instances, if we go back further, even really beyond Wells, we can see in fiction various accounts via Charles Dickens and Washington Irving's account of Rip Van Winkle, where basically Rip Van Winkle goes to sleep one day underneath a tree and wakes up in a future time, having basically a lapse of many years. So he in that sense is a time traveler into the future. So we can see this idea developing in consciousness. And then in Dickens with The Christmas Carol, even though Ebenezer Scrooge isn't the same kind of time traveling protagonist as Michael J. Fox in Back to the Future, we still have this understanding that he is able to go back, see his past as a young man, so we can understand basically why he's become hardened into the miser that we find him in the present. And then also too, he's projected into the future to foresee his own death and basically his legacy that is left, which ultimately amounts to nothing. So on top of these early 1800s examples, we also have more contemporary manifestations where really the rules of modern time travel have been worked out through, once again, the various pulp fiction magazines of the 1920s to 1950s, such as Amazing Stories. So in here, basically we have authors developing, once again, the ideas of science fiction giants like Wells, and expanding upon that based upon later scientific developments. So the scientific impetus of actual interest in time travel goes back to Albert Einstein's theory of relativity, which basically posits, if we think of the concept of the speed of light. So when you're traveling at the speed of light, basically time becomes relative. So in that sense, someone who is theoretically walking is experiencing time moving slower than someone who is traveling at the speed of light. So by relativizing this concept of time, we get the notion that it is possible scientifically that if someone can move through time and time speeds up for them, then in theory it's possible that you could either go forward or backwards in time. So in this sense, we see science and scientists beginning through the theory of relativity really starting to take the mantle from science fiction of H.G. Wells and company and turning these, what we might say, theoretical physics questions into hypotheses. These hypotheses in turn go back to the pulp fiction writers who would have been familiar with Einstein's theory and later developments, which we'll talk about later on in the slideshow, to actually have kind of where we see science and scientific, what we might say, theoretical speculation creating future science fiction, and science fiction also igniting the imaginations of further scientists in the future to postulate further explorations of the notions of time through the creative works of the fictional worlds. So similar to the UFO phenomenon, we see that basically after the Second World War, there seems to be an explosion of reported cases of time travel and teleportation happening amongst the general population. So one reason that is often attributed to this phenomenon of increase is that basically the 1945 dropping of the bomb upon Japan, the atomic bomb, some speculate that it had ripped a hole in the Earth's space-time continuum, which in a way it operated as a doorway to parallel worlds, so that various types of UFOs, ghosts, cryptids, other types of mysterious entities and aliens or spirits of all kinds were able to pour into our reality. So in this sense, this is one hypothesis. Another one I've heard as well is that due to the increase in various types of radar technologies and broadcasting signals, EMF radiation across the globe increased. So as we'll see, EMF radiation, electromagnetic frequency, is quite often associated with various phenomena that we've talked about. So one particular manifestation of time travel is the notion of a time slip. And really what time slip feature is the, I guess we could say, person who is out of time is experiencing a spontaneous time relocation. So various types of psychical and paranormal researchers have various different explanations for this phenomenon. But more or less what people typically see occurring, such as parapsychology author, quite prolific author Brad Steger, he basically suggests that perhaps these time slips are, or when people see ghosts, they're not actually seeing an actual supernatural entity, but maybe what they're seeing is some kind of overlap that is what we might say another living being who in some manifestation, whether through an aspect of the etheric body or perhaps some kind of other subtle body manifestation, has somehow or other crossed wires with our own time. One such example that Brad Steger uses is that the story of a man named Bill. And basically Bill was a member of a frat house who was basically dared by his fraternity brothers to spend the night in what was reportedly a haunted house in Aurora, Illinois. And he accepts this dare, and as he says, I was about to write the whole thing off as the dullest night in my life when I heard noises in the front hallway. At first I thought it was some of my frat brothers sneaking around to scare me. I stepped away from my sleeping bag in a front room to come face to face with a man in a belted smoking jacket about to start up the stairs. And what's most extraordinary is that this man seems as startled as Bill does. So in this sense, it's almost as though both individuals are seeing something that is indicative of being out of the ordinary to themselves. So in a sense, Bill senses that he's startled the man in the same way as though the man himself is witnessing what we might call a paranormal manifestation in Bill's presence. So Bill's account continues. The man at the bottom of the stairs blinked his eyes, shook his head as if to clear his senses. Almost what someone would do if they had seen something that they just couldn't quite make sense of, but believed themselves to basically be hallucinating or in a daydream almost. Then he continued on his way up the staircase. When he was almost at the top, the man slowed, turned around, and looked down at me. We had an eye contact for several seconds before the man resumed his movement up the stairs and walked through a wall. So basically, at the time, Bill thought he'd seen a real ghost. And later on, though, he learned that where in the wall that the man had actually been seen to walk into had once been a door to a bedroom. So later on, Steger hypothesized that basically maybe Bill had actually seen what we might call an apparition of someone who had actually slipped into a time slip themselves, or perhaps even Bill himself was the one. So one way or another, what we have is some kind of an overlap of time periods. So another manifestation for the possibility of teleportation are wormholes. And wormholes are basically a speculative concept that have come out of really what we might call the theory or general theory of relativity by Einstein. And the notion is that if you want to have a visual of what a wormhole is, the bottom illustration here is basically indicative of what we're talking about. So as a description, it can be visualized as a tunnel with two ends at separate points in space and time. So the yellow and the blue being indicative here. And these could be different locations, or they could be actually different points in time, or even they could be both. So in the case with the Brad Steger frat boy ghost encounter, then it is possible that there was some kind of overlap in wormhole, perhaps. Now, recently, Max Tegmark, who's a physicist, was basically attending a panel at MIT discussing the science behind the movie Jumper, which was starring Hayden Christensen. And basically in the movie, Hayden Christensen's character can basically teleport all over the world wherever he chooses to do so. So behind that speculation, Tegmark basically suggests that if someone was going to do that, be able to teleport across the world, then a wormhole would be one scientific explanation to indicate how that would even be possible. So from wormholes, we get into this notion of parallel universes again this week, but this time really in the sense of having some kind of a doorway or a portal like wormhole. So two famous examples through fiction are one through C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia, where the wardrobe is basically from the children's everyday, what we might call World War II British upbringing environment inside the professor's house, to Narnia, beyond the wardrobe, and then also to an Alice in Wonderland, from Alice's regular everyday world down the rabbit hole into Wonderland. So in this sense, we can see by accessing these types of portals or wormholes, an individual is capable of entering into another realm. And this is really, we see again through fiction, the construct of parallel universes arising once again as a concept. So later on, when science gets more into the quantum regions of thought, we get into this idea that basically these portals are possibly branching off into multiple alternative universes. So the ramifications of the notion of being multiple portals to various different realities comes along the notion from the physicist Hugh Everett from 1957 came up with the concept of the many worlds interpretation, which basically this posits that each time we make a different choice on the quantum level of reality, a new universe arises to accommodate this choice. So that basically means if you can think of the near infinite number of choices that every single living and sentient organism makes during any given second with our time upon Earth, you can imagine the infinite new worlds that are popping up all the time with regards to this concept. This is typically known or closely associated with the phenomenon known as the butterfly effect. But it's this idea that anytime we make a choice, or even like minute things, these could even be things that happen upon chance, right? In terms of lower level nature versus sentient consciousness making choices, these things are also too continually manifesting different possible worlds. And from this concept, we get this concept that, or this notion that if there are multiple worlds, then maybe it's possible that one can travel between them. So Fate magazine is a publication that is quite renowned for strange or paranormal phenomenon, kind of bordering on into strange science. And they had an interview with Michio Kaku, who is a renowned physicist who specializes in the area of string theory. And according to this interview, he basically explains that once upon a time he was considered to be an outcast in the physics community. But now that basically the new paradigm in physics and academic positions, particularly the Ivy League centers in the States such as Harvard, Princeton, and Yale, have all gone towards the focus of string theory. The reason for this is that basically with the ability of physicists to begin to smash atoms, this has really rewritten the entire parameters of the scientific models of the physicist understanding of reality. So Kaku explains the origin of the smashing of atoms really takes flight in the summer of 2009, which we talked about last week, this notion of the Large Hadron Collider, which is approximately 27 miles in circumference, and building cost was approximately 8 billion euros or $10 billion. Okay, and the idea is that by speeding up molecules and smashing them at such high frequencies of impact, that they were hoping to be able to prove the existence or find evidence for the existence of an 11th dimension. So in theory, one of these are related to time, and then 10 are related to dimension or space. And you can see here, this place in the last 10 years or so has become quite theorized by conspiracy theorists, and in specific the statuette of the Hindu goddess Shiva, who is associated with the destructive principles, or I guess we could say the destructive principles of the divine quite often in Hindu religion. So the fact that CERN has this out on their, what we might say, grounds of their headquarters, most people view as some kind of appeal to a pagan or anti-Christian ethos that's exhibited by the company, in the sense that it's almost satanic, in that it's appealing to this darker side of nature, as nature or the divine as the destroyer or the creator, or the person, well, it's not person, as in the force that creates through destruction. So in association with that, to link that with the objectives of CERN, a lot of people find that troubling. So when Fate magazine interviewed Kaku, they basically asked whether or not these unseen dimensions he was referencing in connection to the Hadron Collider had anything to do with the various phenomena of UFOs and other paranormal phenomena such as ghosts, psychokinesis, and metal bending. And more or less, Kaku holds to his scientific pedigree and guns, and just simply attesting that he's a physicist, and ultimately what they're after are tangible results or evidence. And what they're looking to find basically is dark matter, and the notion that it's something that can be measured, right? And if that is the case, then it's possible, if they can find such dark matter, that it could constitute large chunks of the universe that seem to us to be invisible, and this may be what the higher dimensions are composed of. So in that sense, this is ultimately what they're setting out to find with the Large Hadron Collider. So in connection, the rise in paranormal sightings and activity, one region that is particularly active, according to various reports, is the southern Florida Bahamas area, off the Atlantic coast or east coast of the southern United States. And basically, many different reports sightings have occurred there, whether it's seeing various strange types of unidentified objects that are traveling underneath water or through the sky or from the sea to the water or vice versa. And reason or associations closely linked with that are the various disappearances in the region, particularly in the region known as the Bermuda Triangle. And the theory goes by a lot of theorists who are UFO buffs interested in the Bermuda Triangle is the idea that many of these missing ships and planes have either been teleported out or have been hijacked by these extraterrestrial or ultra-terrestrial beings that are consistent with the actual sightings of these various unidentifiable flying objects. One of the most famous Bermuda Triangle disappearances is that of the fleet of U.S. Navy Avenger torpedo bombers, which took off from the Naval Air Base at Fort Lauderdale, Florida in December 1945, so just shortly after the war. And more or less this was a training flight where 15 men were led out on what was more or less a practice bombing run. So they were to head out to sea 66 miles due east of the air base and then fly in more or less a simple triangle pattern or flight plan to conduct the exercise and to return back to base. So more or less straight after takeoff, couple minutes after, the strangeness of the flight begins. And more or less, Lieutenant Taylor radios that the sea was appearing particularly white that day, and it didn't look as though it should. And then shortly afterwards, the entire crew's compasses began to spin out of control, and they more or less lost their bearings where they were. So in this sense, they radioed back to flight control, basically suggesting that they had an emergency situation because they knew they were off course, but they weren't able to tell where they were or how to get back home. So about half an hour later, when the planes were getting terribly low on fuel, Taylor radioed his final message back to flight control, and he informed that he thought they were approximately 225 miles northeast of the base. And basically, he seemed very agitated in the message, and his message was cut out in the final sentence of "it looks like we are," and then the radio basically went dead. Now, after the fact, the aircraft and the crew were never found, and not entirely sure exactly where the planes went down. But according to the official Navy reports, it basically, in the report, it suggests that the crew, training crew, had just simply vanished as if they had flown off the planet Mars. So even further adding to the excitement of various ufologists to link such an encounter not only with the mysterious powers of the triangle itself, but also too with the possibility of it being linked to extraterrestrial or ultra-terrestrial manipulation. So in connection to the UFO Bermuda Triangle link, There's a theory attached that basically such occurrences are due to the power of magnetic fields transforming and transporting matter basically from one dimension to another. So in this sense, the appearance and disappearance of various UFOs can be explained by their coming into and out of our dimensions. And at the same time, too, the disappearance of our own planes and ships could also be explained in terms of it being what we might say transported or transformed through the various magnetic fields that are employed in the region, whether via UFO technology or perhaps through some kind of mysterious energy power that what we might say the natural earth itself possesses. So an interesting hypothetical time-lapse situation was National Airlines 727 jet, which in sometime in late 1960s, early 70s, basically on an approach to Miami International Airport, it's reported that the flight control center basically lost all visibility on radar and radio communication with the flight for a time period of approximately 10 minutes. And the strange thing is the plane simply didn't disappear, but it reappeared after 10 minutes. And even more oddly, it reappeared in the exact same spot that it had disappeared. And to even add to the mystique of the whole situation, when the plane landed without any further incident, the crew themselves were completely oblivious to the 10-minute or missing 10 minutes. So it's reported, though, which is even more strange, is that when the crew checked their watches upon landing, basically the various time indicators showed that they were all behind, or all their time devices were behind by 10 minutes to the real time. So one interesting explorer situation in dealing with the magnetic fields, particularly specifically in this case of the North and South Poles, was the famous explorer and aviator Admiral Richard Byrd, who in 1929 was undertaking a flight over the South Pole, and he was on, I guess we could say, record through a broadcast of basically giving an account of what he indicates. If you think of the South Pole as a fairly desolate area with no life per se, we're thinking more predominantly like ice and snow. Certainly not the landscape that Admiral Byrd relays to his listening audience, because it's reported that he found himself entering into a foggy light of area, and basically he all of a sudden, kind of as the visibility below becomes accessible to him, he sees that he's over this green land mysteriously with ice-free lakes, and basically he supposedly sees huge bison-like beasts and other animals that were below, and also too what may have also been some variant of a primitive man, or what we might say Neanderthal or caveman type of inhabitants of this land. And so official record of this sighting / flight recording was explained away in popular terms that Byrd himself had been airborne for a long period of time and was under a lot of physical exhaustion, and ultimately was what he was describing was some form of hallucination. Interestingly enough, though, the various proponents of alternative theories suggested that this was just a mere cover-up for what Byrd had actually witnessed. So more or less, the individuals who take interest in Bird's account are what are known as kind of the lunatic fringe or the hollow earth cult. So this basically, Bird's account is basically falls to the wayside in scientific circles, but the hollow earth cult continues on his account as evidence or proof that he basically had flown into a hole into the hollow center of the earth. And in that, he more or less had seen all these mysterious sights, which basically, if we go back yet again, we see such accounts really going back to fictional authors such as Jules Verne and his narrative from 1864, Journey to the Center of the Earth, or the 1914 book At the Earth's Core. So in this sense, it is a repetition, but also too with the hollow earth, there in early kind of scientific theorizing of the day, in particular the day of 1692, one theorist by the name of Edmund Halley had put forth the idea that the earth itself was composed of a hollow shell, and that possibly too he theorized that perhaps the atmosphere inside was luminous and potentially inhabited. And another aspect of that, according to Halley's theory, was that the northern lights, or the aurora borealis, may have in fact been created through the escaping gas that was creeping or seeping out from the hollow earth's core. So a famous book about the Bermuda Triangle from the 1970s was written by Charles Berlitz called The Bermuda Triangle. And more or less, he suggests that there is an electric charge that is the source behind what we might call the phenomenon of the disappearances at the Bermuda Triangle. And specifically, Berlitz links it with this notion of what we might call an ancient technological power source. So he links it specifically with this idea that near Bimini and other places around the Bahamas, underneath the water, there were what we might call subterranean or underwater ruins of high state civilizations, or the proof thereof. And specifically, Berlitz links this back with the advanced technological civilization of Atlantis. So more or less, the electronic charge or magnetic disruption of the Bermuda Triangle in this sense is what we might say an abandoned technological power source from the ancient world that we simply have forgotten. And yet still the power source itself is still operative, and ultimately the cause of a great deal of mystery and misunderstanding, particularly as it relates to the various ships and planes that have disappeared. So the other phenomenon of interest with regards to the Earth's natural magnetic field are these invisible Earth energy alignments and patterns that are linked to connecting the various world sacred sites, known as ley lines, or they've also been called dragon lines. But the idea is basically that due to the spiritual or magical importance of various places, the reason that they're so highly esteemed is due to the power there residing within the magnetic energy of such locations, which were built intentionally upon the ley lines in order to channel or access these higher levels of energy. And more or less we see this, I guess we could say, in close association with the Earth's natural magnetic field, and particularly with the way that it really dictates or directs a great deal of the cycle of life, particularly as developed with regards to migratory patterns within various types of birds, fish, and animals. So specifically, it's believed that more or less these various animals are being guided through their, what we might be able to say, their reception or awareness of the Earth's magnetic pull or the magnetic field of the Earth. So in this sense, we see that there is some kind of almost, we could call it a sixth sense in animals and migratory patterns in terms of being able to read or follow such energy. Now, with the human mind, it is also believed scientifically as an explanation where the various paranormal activity is witnessed in such regions, such as the Bermuda Triangle, for example, where it's believed that electromagnetic fields are higher. And if we were talking with a paranormal sympathizer, they might say, well, this is because these areas have spiritual or magnetic or magical import, whereas the skeptical scientist may say, well, perhaps these electromagnetic fields are actually inducing some kind of paranormal hallucination where people are more prone to see ghosts and UFOs or cryptids in these various areas where the Earth's magnetic field is increased. So in the timeline, Einstein announces his theory of relativity in 1905. And it's not until 1974, so approximately 70 years later, that physicist Frank Tipler uses Einstein's insights to basically draft the plans for a working time machine. So the interesting thing about Tipler's time machine is this idea that he needs to create a machine that is capable of distorting both space and time. And in order to do that, he basically theorizes this idea that we need to construct a sufficiently large rotating cylinder if we're going to ever create a time machine. And this needs to be so large that basically to build it on Earth would not be possible. And furthermore, it has to be so heavy that any substance we currently are using in technology is just simply not adequate. So in this sense, Tipler's cylinder time machine is far beyond our present capabilities in terms of building materials or building capabilities. So in this sense, it remains what we might say a theoretical construct similar to Einstein's theory of relativity. So with regards to theorizing such possibilities, Rosemary Guiley, who we looked at last week, again a paranormal writer, quite like Brad Steger, she tends to be one of the larger, more published authors of the genre, but she suspects, or at least proposes, that the prospects of someone accomplishing this in the future, there is a possibility this has occurred. And the reason for that, she presents as evidence, is that so-called time tourists have left litter behind for us to find. So what kind of evidence does Guiley find? Well, basically, she may say in prehistoric, I guess we could say archaeological findings. She basically identifies one interesting one is the various 100 metal balls that were found in South Africa, as you can see here in the images on the right, that were supposed to originate from over 2,800,000 years ago. And comparatively to a concrete block wall found in kind of the depths in Oklahoma, or a coal mine with a delicate gold chain, also believed to be about 286 million years ago, or also too a carved stone in Iowa, which is obviously beyond what we would commonly believe to be the technological capabilities of prehistoric people, going back again 260 million years. And similarly, a decorated metal vase from Massachusetts, which was found in the area, and also it was believed to be over 600 million years old. So in this sense, we see what we might say as evidence of various types of metallurgy and types of concrete development, etc., that we would associate with much later ages being dated in a time spectrum that is far beyond our understanding with regards to if these dates are accurate, then this would completely rewrite our understanding of the ancient past. But for Guiley, she sees this as evidence that people from the future have gone back. But how such things would be identified as coming from a more technologically advanced age than ours seems to be a bit of a flaw in the reasoning. But yet, at the same time, if the dating is accurate, then certainly this does seem to indicate some kind of discrepancy with the official historical record. So a different approach to the phenomenon of time travel is through Dr. Bruce Goldberg. And basically, Goldberg is responsible for crafting what we might call a brief history of time travel. And he suggests that a man by the name of Tatos discovers time travel in the year 3050. And more or less, what we could say is the equivalent of Hermes of the ancient Egyptians. So same Hermes Trismegistus, so to speak, right? But in this sense, Tatos, as a manifestation of Hermes, is credited with being the first chrononaut. So similar to astronaut, but now Chronos being time is the time traveler. And in this sense, what is interesting with regards to Goldberg's, I guess we could say, access to such information, is he suggests that we are capable of communicating with such chrononauts when we are in our dream cycle. So in this sense, when the body is in REM, then we are capable of leaving our physical cells, as we've seen with regards to what we might say lucid dreaming or astral projection phenomenon. And it's through these powers of sleep and dreaming that we're able to enter into hyperspace and gain the ability to see the fifth dimension, including the chrononauts that inhabit that dimension. So according to Goldberg, these chrononauts are basically traveling back in time to monitor us and to try and exert influence on our lives to lead us, I guess we could say, in the proper direction in terms of advancing as a species. Now, the first chrononaut that Goldberg meets is one by the name of Traxa, and he reportedly has mastered the ability to hyperspace travel between dimensions. And as part of this, can also reportedly move through walls and solid objects, or even float through the air. So predominantly, his manner of travel we would associate with what we call teleportation. And in this sense, he's reportedly able to beam his physical body back and forth through more or less what we associate with a wormhole or a portal, which is basically caused by a black hole. So in Goldberg's account, we kind of see this, what we might say, a distant echo of Gene Roddenberry's notion of the, what we would say, the transporter room, and being beamed up and down from the Starship Enterprise to various planet surfaces, where once Captain Kirk would say energize, then they would simply dematerialize and rematerialize in different locations. So obviously we see once again through science fiction kind of it's this notion that it is prefiguring or predefining various scientific quandaries or hypotheses. So according to official scientific capabilities of teleportation, basically we've currently reached a stage, at least to popular understanding, of what we would call quantum teleportation. And even though it's a long way from the transport of Kirk and Jean-Luc Picard, it nonetheless is to a certain degree a variation of teleportation, in the sense that it is more what we might call a repliporter, or in the sense of like replicator, but moving of information rather than moving of solid matter. So in this sense, okay, basically what happens is the quantum information, so the exact state of atoms and photons, can be transmitted from one location to another and recreated. Okay, so in that sense, you can manifest an exact copy of something through, I guess we could say, amassing the quantum information about that and then replicating it in, so from location A, and then replicating it in location B, so to speak. So with regards to the pseudo-historical record, the Philadelphia experiment is one such instance where we see almost like a teleportation occur. And more or less what's reported to have happened was just outside the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard in October 1943, the U.S. naval destroyer escort U.S. Eldridge was basically involved in a program known as Project Rainbow, which was more or less testing various cloaking technology and invisibility technologies for the Army at the time. And more or less what occurred, reportedly, is that the warship itself was more or less teleported or transported back 10 seconds in time. So in this sense, there was like this gap. And more or less, it was I believe a 1980s movie that was called The Philadelphia Experiment. It might have been early 90s, but more or less these get exaggerated, even this claim, which is seemingly fantastical in and of itself. But later legend and folklore surrounding this hypothetical event get expanded upon and elaborated as well. So reportedly what happened is when the experiment first began and the effect of the teleportation was setting in, there was reportedly a hazy green light that kind of engulfed the whole ship in kind of a green haze. And then, according to witnesses who were not on board, the entire craft and crew began to disappear from sight, basically by those on the dock that were witnessing the actual Eldridge passing by from the shore. And more or less, the destroyer was reported to have appeared and disappeared as far away as Norfolk, Virginia. And it's believed that the result of what actually occurred in this cloaking experiment was the actual time warp phenomenon, where not only did it go back 10 seconds, it also was teleported to another state entirely. So the major interest or a major issue of concern for the Navy/military was the effects that the supposed experiment had upon the crew. Now, being subjected to this magnetic force field, basically the crew were reported to have disappeared, and having done so, some disappeared in part almost being left with I guess we could say partial physiques, while others ended up dying afterwards or suffering from adverse mental effects. Yet on the positive side, others reported having an increased sharpening of psychic ability. And the eventual, I guess we could say, or lingering ramifications of the event was that long after the experiment, when the sailors were reportedly home in amongst the streets or what we might say various types of local establishments such as bars or restaurants, quite often reportedly these sailors would temporarily disappear and reappear. And obviously this was quite shocking to onlookers or various patrons of the various establishment where these supposed events occurred. So due to the human toll or fallout, I guess we could say, of the casualties, basically the fate of the Rainbow Project was put at a standstill, or it came to a stop, because ultimately they weren't sure, reportedly, whether or not any further experimentation would be safe enough for human beings to attempt and survive. So in this sense, it was reportedly deemed too risky, and the head scientist of Project Rainbow, known as John von Neumann, was reportedly summoned away to work on the Manhattan Project, which is a verifiable historical project which was involved with the making of the atomic bomb. Now, while it was reportedly stopped, it is also speculated that the project was once again resumed. So, former Project Rainbow was born again as in the 1950s or early 1950s as Project Phoenix. And more or less, Dr. John von Neumann and his research team were supposedly called back to investigate the implications of the human factor of the Philadelphia Project. And more or less what Neumann was interested in was this idea that people who were teleporting, basically what brought on insanity, it was hypothesized, was this experience of no reality that the crew became disoriented through. So it's reported that he constructed some kind of computer program to generate an electromagnetic background, which you might link or compare with a type of phony stage where physical human beings would be able to synchronize with some kind of concept of reality or some sense of time and space where there was none. So in this sense, what Neumann or von Neumann was attempting to modify was this void, so that insanity wouldn't result through various people who would be involved in future attempts to teleport. So as part of the Phoenix Project, basically in working with electromagnetic frequencies also associated with radar, the group or Phoenix group eventually became interested in frequency and pulse duration as, I guess we could say, applied to the general populace in the surrounding areas. And basically what they were reportedly involved in experiments upon were upon the alteration of moods. So this started basically upon altering the mood of the base, but ultimately this would be carried over into the civilian population of the surrounding area. And more or less extending upon this, with years of working upon radar, it's hypothesized that by their experiments in changing the pulse rate and pulse width, that they were also not only able to change people's general mood, but also to be able to access what people were actually thinking. So, according to Preston B. Nichols, who wrote the book on the Montauk project, this is basically what is referred to as the microwave oven experiments, because more or less radiation and radar radiation is the same EMF as that generated by a microwave. So one of the findings that they found in these mood control experiments, particularly on the surrounding population, was that basically they were able to increase crime rates or even make people more agitated or animals more agitated by altering the electric frequency of the radar. And as an extension of this, they were also able to actually focus the radar on a car and stop all of its electric functions, reportedly. So reportedly, in connection with kind of some of the, what we might say, the breakaway civilization conspiracy theories that we saw 2 weeks ago in the alien slides, we see this idea that these technologies that were being explored or developed at the Montauk / extenuation of the Philadelphia Project, particularly in the 1950s, were really what we might say an extension of a technology that was extraterrestrial, or so the hypothesis goes, and that such a breakaway technologies could not be something that human beings had discovered for themselves, but yet in similar fashion, Nichols speculates that this advanced tech actually belonged to the race or alien race that had come from the star system of Sirius, with such aliens being called the Sirians. So Philadelphia experiment, but more so Project Rainbow and the various phases of the Phoenix Project, these are all an extension of what we call the Montauk Project, which is more or less a conspiracy theory that suggests that the U.S. government was involved in secret projects that were conducted at Camp Hero or Montauk Air Force Base, which is in Montauk, New York. And more or less, the overall function or overall goal of the program was the development of psychological warfare techniques. And as an extension of this, various different types of exotic research, I guess we could say, developed or were consequences of such experimentations, such as we'll discuss shortly, the supposed manifestation of successful time travel. Now, the Montauk Project itself, as we've mentioned, basically it's the entirety of, I guess we could say, the project is outlined in a series of books by one Preston Nichols, who was reportedly involved in the project, pictured here on the bottom image. But more interesting for the overall framework of the course is the notion that basically the Netflix Stranger Things series was originally going to be called the Montauk Project because more or less a large degree of the what we would call influence or intellectual precursor to the actual content of the fictional show were based upon the work of Nichols and the reported or conspiracy theories emerging from the Montauk Project itself. So in Stranger Things, we see 11 being subjected to various types of psychic experiments in the government research base outside of this small town. But with regards to the actual Montauk Project itself, comparatively, Nichols suggests that it was involved in a lot of work with psychics. Yet again, as we've kind of seen, psychic once again reemerging as kind of the source or the conduit through which one is able to access or communicate with the higher levels of what we might say psychic awareness or ability. And at Montauk Base, reportedly, the various psychics were linked with computers. The psychics would have various thoughts, and then the computer in the initial stages would be able to decode them. And through this, it would then broadcast it out the transmitter and build a thought form. So in this sense, while the psychic would be in a chair in Southampton, okay, then the IBM computer at Montauk would be able to manifest the thought form, I guess we could say, as some type of mind amplifier device. So in terms of being able to, in material manifestation, so to speak. So a type, again, of almost what we talk about of the psychic being the means to the, what we would say quantum theory holds now in terms of being able to teleport things in quantum teleportation. This is almost like a manifestation of that, or what we might say a pseudo manifestation of quantum teleportation. So more or less, it's reported by late 1977, the transmitter was reproducing such thought forms into matter. And more or less, the lead psychic who was involved in the program was a man by the name of Duncan Cameron, who supposedly this is an image of Cameron. And more or less other things Cameron was reported to be able to do through his psychic abilities was he could put thoughts in the heads of other people with the ability to even control other people, almost like a puppet master. And also as well, he could focus on an individual and then be able to see as if though being able to see through that individual's eyes, or hear as though hearing through their ears, or feel as though feeling through their bodies. So the next major development out of the Montauk project was reportedly what is referred to as the Phoenix 3 era, which lasted from February 81 until the end of the project in 1983. And more or less, the objective of Phoenix 3 was to explore the nature of time itself. And reportedly, during this time, what kicked off the project to relaunch as Phoenix 3 was the discovery of a time door. So in this sense, what ultimately happened was the crew was actually able to look at the past and also into the future. And more or less, basically, it was described as though they were capable of traveling through a vortex, which was reportedly a peculiar spiral tunnel. And it was lit basically all the way down. So as one started to walk down, basically they would be sucked in or pulled through this actual vortex. So the means of opening such vortex or time doors was dependent upon, once again, Duncan Cameron. And as with the earlier experiments, it would start with him sitting in a chair and then working in tandem with the transmitter. So the transmitter would be turned on when more or less his mind in sync would be blank or clear, and then he would more or less focus upon a specific moment in time. So we may focus on, for example, the opening a portal through, say, the parameters of going from 1980 unto perhaps into the future to 1990. And more or less, as long as he focused on holding this, I guess we could say, time period within his mind frame, then more or less he would be able to open a portal and keep that portal open as long as he concentrated on the specific time period. So the individuals were not chrononauts per se in Dr. Goldberg's sense who went through the portals, but reportedly, according to Nichols, it was originally they started with derelicts or the homeless, and then eventually moved on to children. So we see here the association with the various children characters within the Netflix series itself. Now, it's reported that some of the children returned, but some didn't, and more or less a lot of recruitment took place within the surrounding community via word of mouth from other children going and acting as what we might say surrogates or even recruiters for the actual military base itself. So reportedly, the program was focused specifically on the year 6037 AD, and more or less who came back or whether or not they were coming back was a bit of a mystery. But in 6037, they were more or less teleported into the future to what appeared or was reportedly a dead city in ruins. And more or less, this city had no signs of life, but at the city center was a square or a town square where basically on a gold pedestal was a golden horse, and the inscriptions around the pedestal were basically the objective where the recruits were sent to read and interpret the meaning of such inscriptions. So more or less, the recruits being sent to the square and the golden horse to interpret the inscription. Nichols suggests he's not familiar with the reason or the actual end that was achieved by doing such. Now, Duncan Cameron alternatively is reported by Nichols to suggest that there was technology in the pedestal, and more or less they were sending multiple individuals to go and try and feel, or I guess we might say psychically intuit, what the technology that was latent within the pedestal was, or be able to decipher the actual relevance of such technology. Another reported objective of teleportation in late 81 or 82 via the Phoenix Project was more or less, it's reported by Nichols that the project researchers were able to actually teleport to what we might say a big pyramid on the planet of Mars, and more or less teleport within the structure itself, and then to gain entrance into the underground areas of such a pit or hypothetical, I guess we could say, pyramid. Another interesting account with the teleportation device, it comes from Nichols suggests August 5th of 83, when more or less they decided to run the transmitter nonstop for several days. And more basically what emerges is that their equipment basically dropped out of sync, and basically they didn't know what exactly the function of the system and how it was attuned to, but more or less what emerges through the portal is the USS Eldridge, which is, if you recall, is the ship that was used in the Philadelphia experiment reportedly. So in this sense, it's almost as though they've turned the machine on and have, what we might say, pulled the Eldridge from what we might say that kind of ether region of the no space from which it originally entered into back in 1943. So ultimately, the end of the Montauk Project comes in 1983 when psychic Duncan Cameron decides to have a moral, what we might say, crisis with regards to the various experiments and happenings at the base. And in order to sabotage the remainder of the project, he decides to create or unleash a monster from his subconscious, which was reportedly big, hairy, hungry, and nasty. And reportedly he manifested it somewhere on the Montauk base, and it more or less smashed everything in sight and ate anything it could get its hands on. And in response, in order to try and shut down the monster, the staff on the base basically rushed into the adjoining building associated with the psychic work of Cameron and pulled all the wires out and broke all the panels that controlled the transmitter responsible for the various psychic manifestations. And after having destroyed the transmitter, reportedly, it was at this point that the beast stopped moving and faded into the ether. So in that sense, the portal is closed to the other dimension from which it had emerged, and that was the end of the reported project. And now the ruins, or I guess we could say, yeah, ruins is probably fair, of the abandoned base basically sit empty, and quite often the curious will go to Montauk and explore the actual ruins. Now, in connection, we can obviously see here, this is where the fictional Netflix account gets this notion of the Demogorgon, right? Now, in actuality, we see here a supposed image of some kind of strange-looking, monstrous type creature that washed up along kind of the coastlines around Camp Hero / around the Montauk base in Montauk, New York. So what exactly that kind of creature is not necessarily self-evident by the photo per se, but ultimately there were rumors that go around regarding what exactly was happening at the base and how there may have been some kind of experimentation into various types of what we might say monstrous beings. So in this, we see the Demogorgon fitting in to the Montauk tradition in alignment with these rumors and theories. So in sum, we basically see in kind of the Project Montauk and the closely associated ideas of teleportation, time travel, kind of an amalgamation of the UFO, alien, fairy, folklore, magical traditions linked with various spiritualist practice, mediumship, etc. So in this sense, really through the course, what we've been working towards are kind of the latter 3 weeks with regards to the emphasis on contemporary ufology and conspiracy theories involving various types of military technologies. But in these, ultimately, we see the roots in the old magical tradition of the Western esoteric tradition, going back to the original mystery traditions through various conceptions of what we might call folk magic and various types of folk understandings of paranormal, supernatural, magical beings associated quite often with the etheric and magical understandings of reality, whether that may be an iron-hating fae or an iron-hating werewolf. Ultimately, we see these associations linking them back once again with some understanding of a power that is operative in the ancient traditions of the magical and spiritual, but yet also too in the modern pseudo-scientific speculations of what we might call the modern side of the paranormal account. But really what we see, particularly this is witnessed in Valier in particular, is this transition from kind of the angels and gods or demigods of the past turning into our contemporary understandings of monsters and aliens, etc. So ultimately, hopefully what you come to see is that a lot of these ideas have existed in other forms and have been reworked according to the zeitgeist of the day, where simply our understandings and our mythologies are evolving with really our cultural, technological understandings of the world.